Welcome to the Corner with Kamal Huggins. This is where we heal, love, and grow together. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the episode. You ever get to a point where you look around and think there's got to be more to life than this? Like you're working hard, you're doing everything right, but deep down, you just feel like something is missing. That was me for a long time. Obviously I had goals, I had dreams, but I realized I didn't have direction. Then one day I was reading this verse that changed everything for me, and that verse was Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2. And that verse says, write the vision and make it plain. Now, I've heard it before because I grew up in the church, but when you hear something before and then one day you read it and it just hits different. So one day I was reading the verse and it said, write the vision and make it plain. And I began to realize, God doesn't bless confusion, He actually blesses clarity. And when I actually started doing what that verse said, which is writing my vision down and making it clear and aligning it with my faith, that's when things began to change in my life. And obviously, it didn't happen overnight. Nah, like it happened little by little. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to break down like what does this verse really mean? I want to also talk about how to create a powerful faith-driven vision board. Also want to talk about how visualization turns belief into action and why wishing isn't the same as walking in purpose. And I also want to share how my vision board literally changed my life, right? So let's start with that verse, write the vision. That means take whatever is in your mind and put it on paper. Because until it's written down, it's just a dream, right? Writing it down takes it from imagination to intention. It tells the universe and it tells God that I'm serious about this, right? And then that second part of the verse where it says, make it plain. That's where I believe most people miss the mark. Because one thing I've learned about humans is we love to complicate things. you know, Most of the times we'll say, I just want to be successful. But what does that actually mean? Success to one person might be a mansion or a yacht. To another person, it might be peace. It might be a healthy family and walking in purpose. So when you make it plain, you have to be specific. You have to say things like, I want to own my own business by X date. I want to wake up healthy. I want to wake up confident and full of energy. Or I want to have $100,000 saved by the end of 2028. That's making it plain. And let me tell you why that's important. It's important because clarity attracts direction. When you know what you want, you start to recognize opportunities that match what you want. But when you're vague, life actually starts to send you everything and you end up busy. You're busy, but you're not productive. You're in motion, but not really in progress. And what I've learned is when you start to write your vision and make it plain, what you're doing is you're giving God something to bless. You're saying that this is what I'm believing for, this is what I'm preparing for. And let me tell you, when faith meets clarity, that's usually when miracles start to happen, right? Now, let's talk about how you can actually build a vision board that actually works. You've probably heard people say, like, oh, you got to have a vision board. You probably heard Oprah talk about it or Steve Harvey or some celebrity, and they say, I have a vision board, right? And you might have never done one before, or you've done one before, and you are probably like most people where you just treat it like decoration. You make it look pretty, you post it on social media, you hang it on your wall, but you never really take a look after you've made it. Newsflash, that's not a vision board. That's literally just a poster. A faith-driven vision board isn't about looks. It's about alignment. So here's how I do mine every year. Actually my partner and I, we do one every single year. We sit down together and we would do it together. But the thing is, our year doesn't start on the new year. It doesn't start in January. We kind of just pick a date. For me, I do one myself. For me, my new year always starts on my birthday. Uh, but when it comes to my vision boards, I have one for my life. So I have a life vision board, and that's the one of who I'm becoming, the kind of man I want to be, the type of legacy that I want to leave behind. And then I do one for the year, right? So my vision board for the upcoming year is what I'm believing for right now. So the first thing that I do when I'm writing my vision board is I sit down and ask myself, what do I want in each and every single area of my life? I'm talking about like, what do I want to accomplish spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, financially, in all the relationships in my life. And then I ask God to show me what's meant for me in this season. Because, sometimes we end up putting things on our vision boards that look good, but they ain't God good, right? And then after I do all of that, the second thing that I do is I find pictures that speak to my spirit, not my ego. You want to be able to find photos that feel like purpose. Like you don't want to just put cars or cash or clothes. You want to put things that bring peace to you, things that speak love, things that speak to discipline, joy, whether it's like traveling, family, healing. Like for example, if I put a photo of a gym on my vision board, it's not just about abs, it's about building discipline and consistency. If I put a picture of a beach, it's not just about flexing, it's about freedom and peace. Because for me, going on the beach in the Caribbean, that brings a lot of peace and freedom to me. Like just feeling the sand on my toes and the heat just coming on my skin, like all of that to me, it just feels like peace and freedom. And then the third thing that I would do on my vision board is I would add scripture or affirmations. You can find what works for you, but I would always include a few verses because I want my vision board to be powered by him. I don't want my vision board to be powered by ambition. I want it to be powered by faith. So I put things like I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Or I would also say the vision is for an appointed time. Or what's another one? I also put faith is a substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, right? And then the fourth thing that I would do is I would be specific. I would write numbers and dates and also write places. So like if I want to accomplish something, I would say by April of 2026, I will be here. By September of 2026, I will have saved X amount of dollars. So I'm very specific when it comes to my numbers and my dates and my places, and even when it comes to traveling, like I don't just write, I want to travel more. No, no, no. I write exactly where I want to travel to. So my partner and I, like, we have this thing where we want to travel to each and every single Caribbean island. So like I would write on my vision board, like I want to travel to Curacao. I want to travel to Saint Martin, you know? So I'll write all of that on my vision board. Then the fifth thing that you have to do is you have to put your vision board in a place where you can see it each and every single day. Because I've learned that repetition builds belief. There's that saying, what's the saying that they say, tell yourself a lie 1,000 times, you start to believe it. So you kind of want to do that with your vision board, even though your vision board is not a lie. Like your vision board is something that you're believing for. And you want to be able to consistently see your vision board so you can start to believe that it's possible. For me, I keep my vision board on my phone. It's actually my screensaver on my phone, right? And then I have the actual vision board as well. I keep it right by my bed. So I want to be able to see it each and every single morning when I wake up and each and every single night before I go to bed. And that's how your faith starts to grow. Faith starts by seeing it before you live it. And I also want to get into the science of faith for a second, since I've just mentioned that. Um, what I've learned is visualization isn't something that mystical. It's not a mystical thing. It's actually how God designed our brain. Your mind doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. That's why when you picture something vividly, your body kind of reacts to it. You start to feel a little bit of excitement, a little bit of hope. Sometimes you have this feeling of anticipation. And what happens is you start making choices that line up with that vision. You start talking differently. You start carrying yourself a little different. You start saying no to things that don't really fit who you're becoming. And I believe that's why visualization matters, because when you can see it, you stop settling. I used to picture myself walking into my office in a suit, all confident, focused, successful. And at that time, I was working in a restaurant, but I saw it so much that eventually my actions caught up to my vision, right? Visualization actually trains your faith to stay ready. And remember, God won't give you something that your mindset can't handle. So every time you visualize, what you're doing is you're preparing your mind for what your spirit already knows is coming, right? And I want you to understand this, that there's a big difference between wishing for something and walking in purpose. A wish says, I hope it happens. Purpose says, it's already written. A wish waits for the right conditions. Purpose creates them. A wish depends on luck, right? But purpose depends on faith and work. And for a long time, I was a wisher. I'd write things down, but I wasn't doing the work. I was praying, but I wasn't preparing. I wanted success, but didn't have structure. I wanted growth, but avoided discomfort. Then one day I heard this phrase. It wasn't even a phrase, it was a scripture actually. It said, faith without works is dead. And it hit me. I just can't believe for it. I gotta build for it. So now when I write down my vision, I back it up with action. If I write down that I want better health, I'm hitting the gym. I'm changing my diet. If I write down that I want financial freedom, I'm budgeting and I'm learning. I'm learning about investing. I'm learning about how can I double my money. If I write down that I want peace, I'm protecting my environment and my mind. Faith starts with action, and action is actually what sustains your faith. That's the difference between wishing and walking in purpose. When I first started doing my vision boards, I was struggling. I was struggling mentally, financially, emotionally. I was working jobs that didn't fulfill me. I was just trying to figure out, okay, what direction to take my life. Uh, you know, and I made my first real vision board in faith. It was actually my girlfriend who sat down with me. She's like, "Hey, do you want to make a vision board together?" And I was like, sure, let's do it. But what I did with that vision board, I'm like, you know what? If I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna go all out. And on my vision board, it had everything that I was believing for. My dream career, financial stability, health, traveling, relationships, peace. And I'll be honest, for the first year, nothing changed. Nothing changed, but something was happening. The more and more I looked at the board was the more I started to change how I thought. I changed the way that I talked. I carried myself a little different. I started praying differently. I started moving differently. I started making decisions that started to line up with what I saw each and every single morning. And slowly but surely, things started to happen. Doors started to open, opportunities came out of nowhere, people came into my life that started aligning with my purpose. And now, years later, when I look back at the old vision boards, sometimes I get chills because I'm living in what I once imagined. Like, I'm living in what I once used to pray for. Every blessing that I have today, I wrote it down. I wrote it down. And every step of growth that I've made, I saw it before it happened. And that's what happened when you write the vision and make it plain. So here's my message for you. Stop keeping your dreams in your head. Write them down. Even if you don't know how it's going to happen, write it anyway. Because when you write it, what you're doing is you're giving God something to bless. When you visualize it, you give your faith something to hold on to. When you act on it, you tell the universe, okay, I'm ready. And understand that you don't need perfect conditions. You just need clarity and consistency. So what I want you to do is take some time this week, get quiet, start to pray and start writing. Write what you want to see, make it plain, and then walk like it's already done. Because the moment you make it plain, God starts making it possible, right? So, if this video spoke to you, if it blessed you, I want you to just comment down below vision, and tell me one thing you're believing for this year. And remember, the life you want is waiting. The life you want is waiting on you. It's waiting on you to write it down and walk it out.